Hello everybody. So this is our first video where I'm going to cover some of the content of the class. So the last class period I promised to give you guys an actual explanation of what sociology is. I think we're far enough along in the semester. Like I said at the beginning of the semester, usually I feel like if I address what sociology is in the first class period, it leaves students kind of confused, and then the rest of the semester they have a hard time connecting what we started with what comes after. Where if I hold off and I talk about it a little later in the semester, I find that the definition even seems easy, right? It seems easy to comprehend what sociology is. So today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about what is sociology, and then I'm going to briefly talk about marriage and the family and how sociology views marriage and the family. And I think this is a good moment to do it because also the way we talk about marriage and the family makes a lot of sense when we look at it through the lens of what sociology is. So I thought I'd start with a couple of definitions. So my first definition comes out of Merriam-Webster, you know, the basic sort of dictionary. And what we'll see as we move through these definitions is that all of them are extremely different from one another, but there's something that is common across sociology. So the Merriam-Webster definition of sociology is the science of society, social institutions, or social interaction, specifically the study of the development, structure, interaction, and collective behavior of organized groups of human beings. So that's our first definition. Basic things that you're going to see within that is the importance of the idea of society, the importance of the idea of social institutions, and the importance of the idea of interaction. Okay, here's one that came off of Wikipedia. So Wikipedia's definition of sociology is a social science that uses various methods of empirical investigation and critical analysis to develop a body of knowledge about social order, acceptance, and change of the social environment. So once again, you see social popping up a lot. But here you see very different focuses. Here we see the focus of sociology as an empirical science, as following empirical methods, also as being critical of society as it exists. Okay. Lastly, I'm going to give, and this is a really long definition, and there's a bunch of pieces of it. So the ASA, the American Sociological Association, offers a series of different definitions of what could be sociology. Also, keep in mind how strange that is. Okay, so the ASA says that sociology is the study of society. Pretty clear definition. Or it is a social science involving the study of social lives of people, groups, and societies. Okay, so it is a social science involving the study of basically anything social. It is the study of our behavior as social beings, covering everything from the analysis of short contacts between anonymous people on the street to the study of global social processes. So it is the study of social beings as they interact from the absolute smallest, most removed level to the absolute largest level, what we refer to as micro and macro. And we've talked about that before. Or it is the scientific study of social aggregation. Basically the idea that individual people then become society. Finally, it is the overarching unification of all studies of humankind, including history, economics, psychology, and philosophy. So here we get the image of sociology as sort of the combination of all the other ways of studying human beings. So why is there so much variation in what sociology means in these different definitions? We see they're very different definitions. They almost seem like different disciplines depending on what you're looking at. And the basic reason is that sociology has no agreed upon objective analysis. So if we were in an economics class, economics studies the economy. If we were in psychology, psychology studies, basically the cognitive aspects of human beings, their brains, the way they think, the way they structure their thoughts, the way they structure their emotions. If we were in a biology class, you study living organisms, right? Bam, that's it. It has an object of analysis. Sociology's objects of analysis maybe is individuals, but a lot of sociologists don't necessarily think that individuals exist separate from their social context. It could be society, but a lot of sociologists don't actually think society is a real thing. They think to talk about society is essentially to remove it from our human actions, remove it from our agency, our ability to act. So that kind of leaves sociology without any unifying object. Instead, sociology is sort of the last part of that ASA definition shows, studies all kinds of things, as we've seen, right? Like sometimes they study marriages, sometimes they study family, sometimes they study gender, sometimes they study economies, social class, all culture, right? All these things are different versions of sociology. So what unifies sociology? And this is, sociology has a specific perspective. It's a certain way of looking at things. Almost every intro textbook you could look at starts with something called the sociological imagination. It grows out of a book by C. Wright Mills. And Mills wants to say that sociology involves taking into consideration three things. So whenever we look at something as sociologists, we want to understand how it's affected by its place in time, so essentially the history leading up to it, how things change over time, right? We've seen that a lot throughout the class, so we'll talk about things like how is it that, social class changes over time? How is it that we see race happening over time? What is the effect of time on it? So time, space, where something occurs changes what it looks like, what its meaning is, how people do it, right? So time and space, right? They affect things in very similar ways often. And third is that we take into consideration how something or someone's place in social structure affects them. Now, social structure could mean things like our place within institutions. This could be like different belonging to different, governments, different territories will alter how we do things. It could also be things like our social class, right? How our place within the economic structure, right? How that determines the amount of power we have to act in certain ways. How it determines our outlook. How it determines our tastes and preferences, the things we like, the things we know. So sociology is that. So the way I want us thinking about sociology is the study of how any given phenomenon, any given thing that people do or make or say, right, is affected by its place within time, space, and social structure. Okay, so with that said, let's move on to families. Families is obviously something that's often very important to people. So how is it that sociology talks about marriages and the family? Well, it essentially talks about it through those three things that we just talked about. That sociology, that the family is affected by its place within time and space and structure. And it's actually very hard to say anything unilateral that crosses all families in time or space. So the meaning of families as a social institution changes, and the way that families looks changes depending on its place in time, place, and social structure. So one way we see that in a lot of the concepts that we have within the textbook. So we'll start with a few of those. So one way that we see families changing, and as well as marriages changing, is the way in which they're organized across space. So behind me I have a graph of families. This is something that's often used by anthropologists, this sort of graph. The triangle is male, the circle indicates female, and equal sign means marriage. And so we exist within a bilateral system, which means that if we want to understand who we're related to, we're essentially related to everybody on both sides. Bilateral systems of descent are not actually all that common. So often the people that we would consider relatives are not relatives in other places and in other times. So in matrilineal descent, you only are connected to the female side of your relatives. So let's say that you are this person, right? A male member of this larger family, a child. You may, in a matrilineal system, you would definitely be related to your mother. You would definitely be related to your grandmother. You may or may not be related to your own father. In fact, your next nearest male relative may be your uncle. And in fact, specifically, if you were to inherit wealth, you would inherit it from your uncle, not your father, right? This male figure would work the same way. He would be related to his mother, maybe not his father, but he would definitely be related to his mother's brother, right? Very different from our system of how to understand relatives, relations. So we see that in a matrilineal system, very different conception of marriage, or a very different conception of families, right? And keep in mind too, this is a larger family. Often within other systems is you don't live with your nuclear family. You're not necessarily even related to members of your nuclear family. Family is a more extended thing. So yeah, there we get matrilineal descent. Patrilineal descent. So patrilineal descent means that you only recognize relatives along the male line. So you would be, in this case, this same relative would be related to his father, maybe his mother, right? Would not be related to his female aunt. May or maybe wouldn't be related to his own grandmother, but would definitely be related to his grandfather. So here we see once again a very different idea of who you are related to. You may not be related to your cousins if it's through a female part of the line. Once again, it's not important that you remember these concepts very closely, but one idea, just remember the idea that what we assume would be a universal, a transhistorical, I've used that word before, transhistorical means that we believe that things exist across time and space, right? What we would assume would be a transhistorical way of understanding who you're related to is actually very culturally specific. It's not universal by any means. Same thing with the idea of marital practices. Within our society, we practice monogamy. Sort of. We'll look at that. So monogamy is essentially a system where two people are married, right? And that's the extent of who's involved in the marriage. But there's all kinds of other systems. In other cultures, it's common to practice polyandry, where one woman may be married to multiple husbands. There's something called fraternal polyandry, where if a woman marries somebody, they marry all of his brothers at the same time. There's polygyny, which is where one person has multiple wives. And then there's sororal polygyny, where essentially, if you marry one woman, you marry all of her sisters as well. Both of the latter two, the fraternal and sororal forms of polygamy, they essentially exist to control how property passes. It's actually a big part of family structure historically. It has to do with property and how is it that property is moving and changing. So what you see is you see that the economy and the family structure are not removed from one another. How you engage with the economy is largely through your family, what resources you have access to, what land you have the use rights over or own. It passes through families. Also, what kind of jobs you're allowed to have or not have historically passes through the family. In the same way, political structures originally grow as something that's familial. So if you think back to when we were talking about different societies in terms of hunting and gathering societies or pastoral societies or through agricultural states, right? All these things existed within an idea of governance that was embedded in the family. So inside of a tribe, essentially what happened was your extended family became a system of government, banned much in the same way, but smaller. By the time you get to chiefdoms or then states, you have specific families within a larger system that are given the right to rule. It's through the family that political power is mediated. So whether we're talking about the economy or politics, family is how we orient it. Nowadays we have a lot of talk about families, the importance of families, the downfall of families, right? This is a big part of our popular discourse. And this largely grows out of the fact that in some ways what we see is that the heyday of the family died out with modernity. In fact, the nuclear family is sort of a signal, a sign of the downturn in families. There's a very interesting book by somebody named Carl Zimmerman, which essentially traces this history out, right? So essentially what happens is that family loses its importance over time as a result of this. As a result of it no longer becoming this sort of system of rights and obligations. That's one of the reasons why we practice bilateral lines of descent. Why you're related to everyone is essentially it's not a system of power. So like if you are talking about this male figure in terms of if this was patrilineal descent, and I ended with matrilineal, so and your nearest relative is your uncle, you have certain rights and privileges with your uncle that you don't have with your father, right? But he can also ask you to do different things as well. So you also have to pay him certain respects. There's certain places within rituals that you have to follow. All these sort of things, right, are like an early system of law often within political systems. It's something called a blood feud. Essentially, which grows out of this responsibility that when somebody acts out against your family, you have to, somebody, steals something from one of your relatives or, murders one of your relatives or whatever, you have to avenge them by, right, the rules of the society you live in. All those sort of things died away. For the most part within modern societies. So the family declines in importance. Family now is just sort of limited to basically forms of reproduction, reproducing the culture within children, what we call socialization, which is also increasingly done by school systems, government itself, as opposed to families. And particularly the birthing and care of children. Are the primary institution, primarily what the family as an institution does now. So in short, right, the way in which we view things in sociology has to do with sort of analyzing things through its time, space, and social structure, and the family. We can see that in sociology of the family, in the ways in which we map the way that family changes on those three things. Okay, a couple of practical things before I shut off the video and call it. So this is going to be our first week doing a discussion board. So at the latest by tomorrow, I will post up some formal instructions. So things that tell you exactly what you'll be expected to do and what the points will. So if you're feeling nervous about that, don't worry about it. It'll be up tomorrow. And then Wednesday, essentially what I'm going to have you guys do is I'm going to have you guys write a short statement, right, about the first article that we're going to talk about on the syllabus, which is going to be Ziff's the mommy deployment. So essentially all I'm looking for from that first post is for you to tell me what it says, right? What the article's about, what you thought of it, reactions, or things that you thought were specifically interesting within it. And then once those posts are up, those posts are going to be due Wednesday, so at some point Wednesday you'll have to do those. They're short posts, it's a paragraph, so don't get too stressed out about it. Once those are up, then you will have until Friday, and of course, like everything else, it's due in this class, it's due at 11:59. It's the last moment before midnight. But Friday, you'll have to respond to 2 other people. So make sure that you have everything read by Wednesday so you can post those comments and read it closely and think about it. And then what essentially I will do then is I will read the post, I'll add little comments here and there. But by and large I'm going to look at the post, make sure that you're doing it, and then I'll sort of talk about it briefly. But this will replace those sort of like when I would break you guys into groups, have you talk about it, then get you into the larger groups and we'd all talk about it together. Essentially those interactions around the articles this discussion board is meant to replace. Okay, so as always, you can contact me via email if you have any questions or thoughts, or if you're confused on anything about what we just talked about today, or if you have concerns or are upset about, not upset, but if you have concerns or questions or confusions about the assignments moving forward. So other than that, thank you, have a great day, and I will post another video next Monday with our next topic, talking about our next topic. So I hope that everything is going well with you guys, and hope that that you are bearing through this period of social distancing fairly well. So thank you, have a great day, bye.